My promotion to director of engineering required that Shirley and I moved to Cincinnati, which was very congenial to her. So we looked for a house, but we couldn't find anything immediately that we liked or wanted to, felt was suitable. So we moved into an apartment while we looked, and during the following months, rumors began to float around about a potential hostile takeover because our business was earning good returns, and it attracted a bunch of shysters from New York, which was a common thing in the 80s. And these guys forced a sale of our company, and as a result, their interest was not in prolonging the life of the company. It was to get milk it dry and dump it, and it was obvious that that's what they were going to do. The first thing they did was take the pension funds and eliminate that aspect of it and put the money in their pockets. And there were a lot of other anti-business developments that we could see was the handwriting on the wall. I really didn't want to leave that company. It was the kind of stuff I really enjoyed doing, and I contacted a headhunter, and within a few months he had located a vice president of engineering at a company called Kusan in Nashville. I took the job, and Shirley and I moved there. Bought a house in the Brentwood, which is adjacent to Nashville, on the south side of it. And I started my work there. And it seems as though, well, when I was at GE, I knew there were always problems and things could be done better. But I didn't realize how well GE was managed. GE knew their costs. They knew that where every dollar was spent. And it wasn't a complicated system, but everybody was accountable for every glove and so forth, and it was a great system. And the people that managed their departments knew where their costs were and where they were making money. But I didn't find that when I left GE. I never did find a company that was as well managed as GE was in those days. And I was, after I left Kusan, I did consulting for a number of companies, and they were all blindly flying along, not knowing what products made them money and what didn't, or where their costs were, or how they could do better even with the ones that they were making money with. It was incredible. But I went to Kusan, and again, the place was they had made a money in 7 years, and they had $68 million worth of interior plastic parts for GM. We made all the interior Corvette parts, Pontiac parts, Oldsmobile parts, all tremendously value-added stuff that should have been raking in the bucks by the carloads. And everywhere it was just stupidity that prevented that from happening. And it started with the president, my boss. He was unconscious. There were so many salaried people running around and not doing anything, and hiding, and criminality, kickbacks. Just a terrible mess. And of course, when I came there, I was a foreigner, a stranger too there, and I was. Others knew what was going on, and they were benefiting from it, and they didn't want me upsetting the apple cart. They didn't know me, and of course I was about to upset the apple cart. Anyway, I began to find out things and suspicious-looking activities, and GM was such a blundering walrus in thin water that they didn't seem to know what was going on either. I'll give you an example. We had a job for Toyota, a GM plant in Fremont, California. They had a joint venture making cars out there. One of the pieces was the part that covers the key, the ignition key, and it had to fit on the steering column and it had a reverse angle on it, which meant that it wouldn't come out of the mold without a cam to give it clearance. Now I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but in any case, any tool engineer of the experience knew instantly that it had to have a cam. But he built this mold without a cam, and of course the part wouldn't come out without scuffing and scraping the surface. So he put that, gave samples to GM, and GM of course rejected them, and he quoted him a price of $18,000 to put this cam in there. And he put that in our shop, the shop that Kusan had down there in Nashville. And so and it was theft actually, because the cam, to put the cam in there was about $5,000. And so they shouldn't have had to do that to start with. I mean, it should have been incorporated right in from the initial stages. They billed GM $18,000. This tool engineer manager worked for me, and I asked him, I said, Jim, didn't you see that undercut or that reverse angle there when you quoted this job? He says, oh yeah, I said, but we can hit him. So anyway, that was atmosphere there. I'll give you one more example. We made the dashboard and the carrier for the dashboard for the Corvette, large pieces of width of the car, and we were having all kinds of trouble with the carrier for the dashboard that we were trying to mold. And this was an old tool, and I looked at it one day when they said it was down again, and they were hauling the pieces every day from Nashville up to Bowling Green in a truck. We couldn't even get a truckload ahead of the assembly lines. And of course when it went down, it was a lot of overtime and panic city. Well, I didn't know that there was an engineering change due in January, and this was like in the middle of the summer. And this engineering change involved tilting the surface of the dashboard 3 degrees. They were having a reflection from the sun off the gauges, and they wanted to tilt the angle of the dial and the face of the dashboard 3 degrees to keep the sunlight from reflecting in the driver's eyes. This change was a very major change to the tooling, and actually they quoted $160,000 to make the change, and GM had written a purchase order for it. So we had the check, but there was no way. Well, I asked Jim what kind of a stockpile he had built up in order to buy time for this tooling to be sent to the tool shop. And we're looking at 6 weeks to do this work, and that was a pretty tight schedule even at that. Oh, he said, I don't know. He said, we can't get 2 days ahead, let alone 6 weeks. And of course GM was tooling adjacent parts to fit to this angle, and the scheduled date for production was maybe January 23rd or some such date. And we were, but he wasn't concerned about not making the schedule. He could care less. And this guy was a highly paid engineer. So I got a hold of my old Japanese buddy, and I took Jim up to Chicago, and we met him there, this Japanese, and I got a quote for $150,000 for a brand new mold within the time frame that we needed it. In fact, they promised delivery in the middle of December, and also incorporated some improvements that I made to the tool design. And so not only did we make $15,000 beyond the tool costs, we made the date, and also made a much better mold that ran productively on a continually normal basis rather than always panic mode. And so this was a very, very expensive part. Once we got the new tool in there, we really made hay on that one. But anyway, there were several other major things I was able to do without even hardly lifting a finger. So I was there about 11 months, 10 or 11 months. I had done quite a bit to move the tool room to a different location in Nashville so we could get rid of some of the extremely high rent that we were paying for the building that we were using. And of course, this mold and another major project. But Maybe I'll recount another issue of the fairyland insanity that was going on there. Before I was hired there, my boss had made an agreement with IBM to permit IBM to place machines that they were importing from Germany into our Evansville plant, and that we would mold the bottom of a new computer case housing. It's a very complicated and expensive part. Responsible for these new presses and the tooling and the development. But we would provide the space and other associated assistance, maintenance and that type of thing. The guy at IBM's name was, and he was well, it's hard to imagine IBM would employ a guy like this. But he was a man in a world all his own. He actually had these huge, two of them, 800-ton plastic molding machines, taken apart in Germany and flown over here, flown to Evansville, and reassembled in our Evansville factory. I have no idea what that cost, but these machines were several 100,000 pounds apiece. They're probably 30, 40 feet long, and I was very familiar with that size because I had quite a number of that size in Louisville when I was at GE. So I couldn't believe that he had actually found a way to fly them over here. But he was determined that he would have German equipment, and the gauges were all in German, everything was German. But anyway, they put these presses together and started to put the molds in that IBM had built, and they were using white Lexan, which is a very heat-sensitive material. It's difficult to mold it, but it's a good material. But in those days, it was a lot less sophisticated than it is now. So anyway, they couldn't mold them without burning, which meant that the material was getting too hot in the pre-processing part of it before it was injected into the mold. They wouldn't accept any burn marks or black specks that were being generated from the processing parameters. And so when I came there were several thousand of these parts that had been absolutely rejected by IBM on their stuff, and they were trying to pin the costs of those parts on us. Now, Lexan is a very expensive material, and so there was a little less than $100,000 worth of parts that they wouldn't accept stacked in that Evansville building. And of course, it was in our way too. They wanted us to pay for the installation of those machines. Yeah, it was a mess. Nothing had been documented. It was all verbal, and the whole business of those German presses was a topic of constant conversations at Kusan. And one day, the president called me and the finance guy and a couple other guys into a big meeting, and he said, "Bert wants us to come up to Lexington and talk this thing over. So I've decided we're going to go tomorrow. We'll leave from here and go to the airport. I'm going to take the Lear up to Evansville, and we'll pick up the plant manager there. I can't remember his name offhand, but anyway, we left the next morning and flew to Evansville and picked up the plant manager, then flew to Lexington and rented a car there and drove over to the IBM plant. And somebody met us at the gate, took us into this meeting room, and there wasn't any sign of Bert at this point. Then suddenly he burst into the meeting room and he said, "All right, this is the story. I want you to decide whether you're going to accept this $68,000 installation charge and half the scrap. We're looking at about $100,000 here." He said, "I'm going to give you 10 minutes to make up your mind what you're going to do about that." And then he left. So there we are, sitting in the IBM conference room with an ultimatum from a customer who is in the bucket. We're the ones that are holding all the equipment and the stuff, and he's the one that owes us. So we're sitting there, and the president turns to each one of us, and I think there were four of us, as I recall. And he said, well, what should we do? I think we should just go ahead and pay it and be done with it. And of course, the other the other two guys agreed with him, but I just shook my head no. I said, I think we just ought to make him sweat and let him pick the tab up. But of course, I got overruled, and pretty soon Bert came back in, and our president said, yeah, okay, Bert, we'll pick it up for you. And then so we had to go back to the airport, and I don't know what that trip cost us other than the capitulation at IBM, but it must have cost numerous thousands of dollars to rent that Lear and hold it all day, or the best part of the day anyway. It was a hopeless case. But that spring, early spring, it was maybe March or so, he came up with this big idea that we all should go to a quality control, 2-week quality control thing in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the tuition was $7,500 a piece. And of course, I'd already been a manager of quality control at GE, and I'd had courses in statistics and stuff, and I didn't like that aspect of it, and I didn't want to go. I didn't think I needed to go, and as it turns out, I really didn't need to go. The stuff that was covered there I'd already had some years before. But anyway, he absolutely was adamant. Nope, he said, everybody's going. I don't want to hear any more about it. So I went, and I was up there 2 weeks. And I came home over the weekend, went back. It was enormously expensive business. And the morning after I came back, I was in my office rooting through the mail and trying to get reoriented as to what I needed to do that day. And he called me in his office, which was right next door to mine. And I walked out of mine and into his office and sat down, and he said, well, this isn't working out. We don't need you anymore. He fired me the morning after spending all that money on me, and I couldn't get any other reason for being fired, but of course I knew it wasn't working out. It just was too stupid. So he gave me 2 or 3 months' salary too, payoff. He was generous enough with the severance, and so I got in my car and went home. It was pretty slow going. I was in my 50s, and the demand for that age man certainly is not what it would have been 10 years earlier or whatever. But nevertheless, I sent out resumes and talked to everybody I knew. I wasn't getting anything at all. I got tired of sitting around the house, and so I decided to sell cars again. I'd done it once, and because I wasn't going to get rich, but at least it give me some income and something to do. I'd heard about Beeman Pontiac. He was the biggest car dealer in Tennessee, and I heard he was a Christian. So I went down to the office, and I interviewed with a woman, actually, and she said she'd call me back in a few days. So I did. I got a call in a few days, and she asked me to come back for another interview. So I met, it was kind of funny. I went into her office, and the waiting room was rather large there, and there was a lot of traffic through her waiting room for some reason. And several times these guys came walking through and looked at me and kept on going, and I began to realize that I was getting a third-degree look before they even bothered interviewing me. So, after about 45 minutes of waiting or so, she called me in, and this fellow, one of the managers there, he was the employment manager. He interviewed me, and he was really pleasant, typical sales guy. So he told me that he wanted me to take a lie detector test, and he'd set it up and let me know when it would be available. So a few days later, I got a phone call, and I was directed to go to this certain office there in Nashville. So I went there, and I took a lie detector test. It was a little scary. I knew I had never committed any mayhem and violent rapes or anything, but when you start thinking about it, yeah, I guess I shouldn't have done that or whatever. But anyway, the test lasted for several hours. It was rather extensive. But anyway, I passed it, and a week or so later, I got a call to come in for training, 2 weeks of training. And the same guy that first interviewed me was the trainer, too. And there were 32 candidates in this class, and men and women, mostly younger people. Although there was one guy that was retired from the Navy, and he was much closer to my age, and we became pretty good friends. And we went through this class together, and he really was, he was reluctant about becoming a car salesman, and I encouraged him that I thought he could do it, and anyway, I helped him gain a little confidence and at least stick through the training. So he was assigned to the Lincoln Mercury dealer that Beeman owned. Beeman owned 7 dealerships there in Nashville of different kinds of cars, and he had a big used car lot too. On the last day, the trainer assigned job locations to each one of us, and he assigned my friend to the Lincoln Mercury dealer, and that was the last one he assigned, and he assigned me to Beeman's Bargain Barn, which was the used car lot section of the business. And I was really disappointed. I didn't want to sell used cars. The connotation, it was, I thought it was demeaning or something. I don't know. I guess it piqued my pride. But anyway, I reported to Beeman's Bargain Barn the next day. And just an aside, while I was taking that course, it was in January, because at one lunchtime I walked down to the library, which was not too far from the training station there, and I was standing inside, and I looked up at the TV, and I saw this explosion of this rocket and pieces flying in the direction, and everybody was standing there all really upset, and it was the time that the rocket blew up and killed those astronauts. It must have been 1985 or 86. It must have been January of 86, approximately. But the woman astronaut was killed, and teacher. She was a teacher, and they landed just off the Florida coast in the water. One of the rockets developed a leak at the seal, and they caused an explosion, which resulted in their deaths. But anyway, I reported to that office there, and it was formerly an old restaurant, or formerly a drive-in restaurant, and they'd purchased it and converted it to a used car lot. And it was in a good location, a lot of traffic there. And the manager there was really a nice fellow. He was a Christian guy, and 2 of the other sales guys had been there for quite a while, were Christian, and they were outspoken about it. All of them were. So it was a non-aggressive kind of place to work. It was pleasant enough to work there. Above each desk was a sign on the wall that said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And Beeman was, I was told, I'd never met Mr. Beeman, but the boss told me that Mr. Beeman said that if he caught anybody puffing a car, that they would be immediately fired. And he told me that was his policy too, that you don't say anything about a car that you don't know for sure. You can say it looked great in your driveway, but you can't say that it's going to be totally trouble-free or anything, because after all, it was a used car, and it had a 60-day warranty, but it's still, they were all used cars. But Beeman bought the premium used cars, low mileage cars. His stuff was good. I drove every car before I sold it, or attempted to sell it, when the shipment would come in, and usually they came from Texas, uh, where the rusting situation doesn't exist. And they were usually they were nice cars. I wouldn't have been afraid to buy any of those. He did. I know one day they brought a shipment of cars in, and it was a really nice station wagon, uh, unloaded, and I thought, boy, that probably is going to sell really well. So I always took them around the block just to get a feel for them. And the boss encouraged that. He said, if you know your product, you'll be able to sell it a lot better and smarter. And so just a quick trip around the block would probably draw a pretty good conclusion of what the thing was like. But anyway, I got in this car and I drove around the block, and it ran fine. But I looked at the speedometer for the mileage, and it had over 100,000 on it. And I couldn't believe it, because I knew that anything with more than 75,000 or something went to the auction block, and when we took a trade on a car. So I couldn't believe that he was going to put this 100,000 mile plus car on the lot. So I asked him, I said, I told him that car had over 100,000 on it, and I thought it might be a little harder to sell. And he said, oh, no. He said, it's only got 11,000 on it. And I said, well, I could be mistaken, but I don't think so. So we went out and looked, and sure enough, when he had bought that car, and he made trips to Texas to buy these cars, and when he bought the car, he looked at the speedometer and read 11,000 instead of 110. So it didn't go on a lot. He sent it right over to the in the group that was going to the auction block. So it didn't stay on the lot. It was never offered for sale. Another car we had there was a Toyota, and it was a nice looking car, fairly low mileage, 20 or 30,000 on it. And I didn't sell it, one of the other fellows sold it. And the guy came back a few days later, and he said, I took the car over to the garage to have it aligned, or the wheels balanced or whatever, and he said that they told me they couldn't do it because it was all rusted out. And so we got to looking at it, and sure enough, the battery had leaked from the prior owner down over the suspension and frame, and actually had rotted the framework that held the front spring section together. And the front suspension was actually considerably out of alignment. So of course he took it right back, and I don't know what happened to it. It might have gone to the junk pile, but it was a loss, that's for sure. But I did well there. I sold a lot of cars, and I could have made, at the rate I was going, if I had averaged it for the rest of the year. And but it took a month or 6 weeks or more to get into the swing of it and be able to start selling. But I sold at the rate of about $60,000 income a year, and which is pretty decent income for car selling. But I found that the used car business is where the salesmen make the money. Every car on the lot had a price that the boss put on the sticker, and that price was double what they paid for it. So if the car was selling for $5,000, he had paid $25,000 for it. So that gave the salesman a nice piece of space to work, because if the salesman sold the car at what the dealership had paid for it, he didn't get any bonus. He got a bonus on what the difference was between what the dealership had in it and what they could get for it. And the more you sold, the more bonus you got for that gap, that profit. So if you weren't selling much and you were forced to sell at low numbers because of your inability to get more out of the customer, you starved to death. So the turnover there was, of the 32 candidates in that class, by the time I quit, maybe 6-8 months later or whatever, something of that nature, the old Navy retiree over at the Ford dealership and me were the only remaining of those 32. The other guy that was assigned to the dealership with me was a Granada veteran. And he was a nice guy, but he was kind of gloomy, and when he went a couple of weeks without selling a car, it was more than he could handle. He got so depressed that he couldn't have sold an Eskimo a heater. I discovered it at Frankfurt, that a good salesman acts as though he doesn't give a darn whether you buy it or not. He's there to help you pick it out, and he'll get your confidence and everything, but he doesn't show any anxiety about anything. If you think about it, or if you haven't thought about it, just think about it for a minute. The best salesman you've ever encountered was on top of the world, and he may not have had 2 nickels in his pocket, but he was clever enough to not let you know that he was really desperate to make the sale. Knowing the product and being confident and at ease is a way that you can sell. And once I learned that technique, it wasn't hard to sell cars. It was a tiring job. It was a hard job. Selling cars is a very difficult profession to be in, and because you've got to spend a lot of time there. We had the same kind of deal there as we did at Frankfurt, where every morning you had a sales meeting, and you were expected to be there whether you were on first shift or the second shift. So if during the weeks that I worked second shift, I'd go in at 8 o'clock in the morning and go to the sales meeting, and then I'd stay there all day till midnight that day. So that was a lot of hours, 12, 15 hours a day. It wasn't a job that I wanted. I never liked to work for money, and that's all that was. You just worked for the money. When the car was gone, that was the end of it. You never saw the car again, or the customer probably, and there was no satisfaction in that at all. Anyway, I made good money, and it was a pleasant atmosphere to work there too. We had fun. The guys that worked there were, as I said, they were good guys. But the temptation to lie and cheat when you're selling is always present. It'll cause you to make the sale. Boy, a lie is a real temptation. It takes a strong integrity to be a good person and be a salesman in that kind of a business where you're depending entirely on commissions. I did have a couple of interviews during the time I was looking, and I looked for almost a year, and I sent out 1,000 resumes. Every day I went over to the library there near the dealership, and I'd look through the newspapers for ads or leads that might lead to a job. I worked at it diligently, and it was depressing not to even get responses most of the time. Rarely got a response. I did get a response from one company located in Charllevoix, Michigan, which is a town, beautiful little town along the upper edge of the western edge of the peninsula of Michigan. The name of the company was Lexolite. It was individually owned by this guy that invented the Lexan street lamp globes, and he started a business up there from that basis, and he was very successful, and he had built a plant in Tennessee about 30 miles west of Nashville. So it had some interest in me, for me, in that it was close to Nashville, basically, at least his new plant was. But I wasn't going to spend all that money traveling to Charllevoix, Michigan, because it's an isolated place up there, and pretty expensive to fly. It was about a 12-hour drive from Nashville, so I thanked him for his offer, but I didn't. I told him I didn't go up that way very often, and I would stop by if I ever came by that way. So I decided I didn't want to go up there to Michigan anyway. Well, anyway, a month or two passed, and I got another letter from him, and he offered me $10,000 if I would come up there and take a job with him. And if it didn't work out, then he would give me the $10,000 finder fee. Of course, there was a salary attached to this job, and he wanted me to be the engineering manager of his company. Well, that certainly caught my attention, so I didn't waste any time getting in my car and driving up to Charllevoix, Michigan. It took more than a day to do it. It was a long trip up there. But anyway, we had a long discussion, and I was a little bit uncomfortable with him. But anyway, I didn't have any choice, so I agreed to go to work for him. So he said, "Well, I want you to go over to the plant in Tennessee and straighten it out and do something." He had some things for me to do over there. So I drove back down to Nashville, and then I went over to this plant, and it was a nice plant. It was new, and he was running some production, not enough to support it, but he was running, and there were some things that needed correcting and so forth. So I did the things that he wanted me to do, and then he asked me to come up to Charllevoix and move up there and near the plant. So I drove back up there, and he put me up at a lodge next to the lake there, a little inland lake. Very beautiful country up there, but it's up pretty far north, and the winters are nothing to laugh at. In fact, the plant was located right on the edge of Lake Michigan. The water is actually lapped against the foundation of the building in one corner, and the windows around the office building, it was a one-story office building, had panels prefabricated in order to cover them during the winter, because the snow actually rose above the window levels there. And of course, everybody had snowmobiles and skiing and everything. It was a really beautiful country, beautiful place up there. And just north of that is Petrosky, which is a famous resort town, famous for its fudge, and famous for its flowers that line the highway leading into the town for about a mile. It's really a unique place. You're driving up the highway, and these flowers have been planted right next to the pavement leading into town. It's an old town, and it's been famous for quite some time. And then, of course, the lake there near Charllevoix was great for sailing, and he took me out on his sailboat and taught me to be a deckhand on a sailboat, which involved a lot more than I could learn in 1 or 100 trips. But anyway, we were involved. He and another guy and myself were on his boat, and I had to pull a rope at the time that he hollered at me to do it. So I performed well enough, I guess, but we didn't win the race. But anyway, I liked it there, but I didn't think Shirley would. And because it was out in the country, and the plant was not near any town. And of course, the winters up there are harsh, to say the least. There were so many trails across country through the fields, and the farmers permitted these trails to pass over their property and through their pastures and so forth, and they cooperated by taking down the fences that these trails crossed so that there wouldn't be any hazard for the snowmobilers. I was kind of looking forward to the winter, but I had some problems with him. It wasn't a pleasant atmosphere to work. The people there were unhappy, and I worked there for about 2 months. He gave me a company car, a nice old '98, brand new one that I picked out at the old garage, and the salary was very good, but it just wasn't. I knew it wasn't going to work out. I knew that he and I were going to come to loggerheads. So I decided that I would talk to him about termination. So I went in his office one day, and I told him that I didn't think it was working out, and that you know, I thought that we got to separate. And he really didn't want me to go, but I really didn't expect to get any $10,000 either. I wasn't naive enough to believe that he would write a check for $10,000. But after a discussion, and he saw I was determined not to stay, he picked up the phone and called his treasurer, and he said, "Bill, write a check for $10,000 to Don." And so I went over to Bill Nye's office, and he had the check there for me, so I got in my car and drove back to Nashville. I had spoken to Shirley the night before I left up there, and I told her I was coming back to Nashville. I was going to quit. And we talked, and briefly, there wasn't a lot to say, because I was going to see her the next day. At least that was the plan. You know, she'd been living at Nashville by herself for the past 2 months, roughly, that I'd been in Charllevoix, except for a couple of visits that I made. But she was essentially alone there, and that troubled me a great deal, and I wasn't ready to bring her up to Charllevoix. But I drove back down. It took me, I didn't get away from Charllevoix till late in the afternoon, and so I drove till pretty late that night, and I stayed at a hotel somewhere. And the next day when I arrived in Nashville, I went in the house and I couldn't find her. I called out to her, and I heard her say she was in the bedroom, so I went in there, and she was in bed. And I could see she was in terrible pain. Her face was all contorted. And I asked her what was the matter, and she said, "Well, I got something wrong with my back. I can't get out of bed." And I said, "Well, how long have you been like that?" And she said, "Well, this is the third day." Oh gosh! And she was there by herself, and and she didn't tell me on the telephone. She said, "I didn't want to upset you when you're driving down here." And so anyway, I called the ambulance and took her, had her admitted to the hospital. I was really upset that I didn't know about it earlier, and that the neighbors hadn't even called or volunteered. Shirley called the neighbor woman. We didn't know them very well. We hadn't lived there that long, although certainly when Shirley called and said she would like to have a little bit of help, the woman went over there and made her some tea, I guess, and spent a few minutes and then left and never came back or never called or anything. So Shirley was stranded there. I really feel terrible about that still today, and that was 1985, about 1985. And that was the beginning of her pain and difficulty for the rest of her life. I got her into the hospital, and she had so many tests and so forth, and she was in such pain, and her back apparently had arthritic spurs growing on it, and one of them something had impinged on the nerves in her lower spine, and it just was driving her up a tree with the agony. And they gave her so many medicines that it affected her heart rate, so that delayed any surgery until they were confident that her heart was not failing. So she spent a month waiting for that surgery in the hospital. It was, I felt like strangling that doctor. But in any case, he operated on her, and he left her with a dropped foot. In other words, he cut a nerve that affected her right foot, so she had to wear a foot support for a long time after that. It finally improved some, but it was always a source of tripping for her. But nevertheless, she came through that surgery and had some relief for a while. I got a call from this headhunter that he had a job for director of operations at this company in Michigan. Well, I think I'll stop this one here, as it's already getting too long, and we'll go to the next one for my adventures in Kalamazoo, Michigan.